Rena has that she might want to share as an afterthought to those of you who are here. Um, but Rena, hello, welcome, and thank you. I know you have a crazy schedule, and I so appreciate you making the time today. I wanted to ask you, what did you think you were going to be when you graduated from high school?
When I graduated from high school, I think I knew I wanted to be a lawyer, so I worked towards that. I'm an immigration lawyer like you, Monica. So um, that's what I thought I would do.
And you went straight to college and law school from there?
I did. I
Wow.
did.
You're one of those few people that knew right at high school. Um, I've even had people on this call that say they never went to high school. uh, Basically, I'm going to ask you, I'm going to share with you a little bit about Rena. Rena has worked, is that correct, in sub-Saharan Africa? Is that correct?
Yeah.
Has worked in sub-Saharan Africa as well as other countries, and she primarily is interested in resettlements and working with refugees, and has a lot of experience with the law, of course, because of her background in law. And tell us your journey. So, what happened when after law school? Where did you go?
Um, okay. Well, between college and law school, I was in the Peace Corps for 3 years. So I lived in Benin, and I kind of learned a little bit about working in different environments and different, within different cultures. I learned a lot about the refugee process and movement during that time. The genocide in Rwanda was happening. And believe it or not, refugees were fleeing all the way across Africa from Rwanda to Benin. During that time, the civil wars in Sierra Leone and Liberia were in full swing. And so there were definitely refugees coming into Benin at that time and surrounding nations. And so I started to get a little bit of, interested in working in refugee law. I knew I wanted to go to law school, but I took that time to be in the Peace Corps. And then when I came back, I finished law school. And my first job out, I worked for a judge in the state appellate court, which was a really good training in legal writing and research. And then I moved on to my first job at HIAS, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. They go by HIAS, and I just started right into refugee and immigration law. So I worked with asylum seekers, and our organization is HIAS was very involved in refugee resettlement. So I did a little bit of refugee resettlement work and worked with refugees overseas quite a bit. And that was my first job out of law school, really. Yeah. Do you want me to start the slideshow, Jill? I don't know. Is Jill on?
What other places have you worked other than
Oh,
in
you are
Jewish
muted.
resettlement?
I'm sorry.
Yes, I was. No, that's my fault. Other than Jewish immigration, what other agencies did you work for?
I've worked with several different agencies in the United States doing immigration law. I've worked at KIND, Kids in Need of Defense. I've worked at Human Rights First, Clinic, Catholic Legal Immigration Network, a lot of different nonprofits. I also worked overseas quite a bit with UNHCR, with refugees in various different settings,
Would you
mainly to
explain what
do.
UNHCR is for people who don't know?
Oh, yeah, sure. It's United Nations High Commission for Refugees. So the UNHCR is tasked with taking care of refugees worldwide, essentially, providing kind of advocating for refugees in third countries with the host government. So if a refugee is from, let's say, Sierra Leone and living in Benin or living in Ghana, UNHCR would be tasked with advocating for them to stay in those countries and receive refugee protection. Um, um, with those governments, with those host governments. UNHCR also exists quite robustly in the United States as well, but we have a very strong NGO network and a very strong, obviously, immigration lawyers network that fight for refugees on the private sector, on the private end. But UNHCR is also very active with advocacy with the U.S. government. So, and depending on, the treaty status of that country, and I'll talk a little bit about the refugee treaty as I go through the slides, UNHCR's involvement shifts. So if the host government can grant refugee status through their own legal mechanisms, then that's great. If not, UNHCR can give them provisional status in that country. So my job was to help people get refugee status in certain countries. So I was a refugee status determination officer in Egypt, and then I worked throughout sub-Saharan Africa mainly with resettlement. And I'll talk a little bit about resettlement as being one of the durable solutions for refugees in the slideshow. Any other questions, Jill?
No, I'm wondering if anybody has any questions that they want to ask. Feel free to unmute yourself. If not, go for it.
Okay, all right. So this is just a simple slideshow I put together. Almost all of this data is from UNHCR. They have the most up-to-date world data. Obviously, if I were to give data, look for data for the United States, UNHCR would have a lot of it. But a lot of these NGOs that we work with.
Can you explain what an NGO is?
Oh, yeah, a non-governmental organization, like a nonprofit.
Like Red Cross is a non-governmental organization.
Yeah. Okay. So let me just move that. Okay. So this is just kind of forced displacement at a glance. And I was told to present on, 3 or 4 different types of scenarios: refugees, asylum seekers, stateless persons, and those who are internally displaced. All of these are types of persons who don't have permanent status in the place of where they're living. Some people are forced to flee. Some people are born without immigration or citizenship status. And some people, when they're forced to flee, they cross an international border. Those who do not cross an international border and those who cross an international border are considered refugees or asylum seekers. And internally displaced persons are those who are forcibly displaced within their home country. And stateless individuals are those who do not have citizenship or do not have any citizenship of any country. And I can talk about refugees and asylum seekers and a little bit about internally displaced persons. I don't have a whole lot of experience in working with stateless individuals, although I'm familiar with the conventions that grant stateless people some sort of status. But as you can see on this slide, 117.8 million people were forcibly displaced worldwide. And this is, believe it or not, is a decrease from prior years. And there's probably a lot of different reasons for that, but it's still one of the record highs. And so asylum seekers, we have 9 million worldwide, 9 million people crossing an international border and seeking asylum. They don't necessarily have asylum. They're probably seeking it with the host government where they're located. And if they're granted asylum, they can become refugees. There are other ways people are able to get refugee status and not necessarily be an asylum seeker. I can talk a little bit about that in the next slide. All right. Any questions? I'm not actually looking at the screen, so if a hand is raised, Jill, you're going to have to let me know if there's a question.
I will do that, I promise.
Okay, because I'm looking at the slides. Okay, so who is a refugee? So this is defined by international law. There's the 1951 Refugee Convention, in the 1969 protocol, and that sets the global standard. During World War I, there was no convention for the protection of refugees. And that was obviously very problematic because there were a lot of refugees crossing international borders, but without status. The main ones, obviously, being the Jews fleeing the Nazis. And because of that, the Refugee Convention was created after World War II. And a few years, almost 2 decades later, the 69 Protocol was released. Now, the 69 Protocol, in my opinion, is the one that grants and sets out the refugee standard in a more clear way. Basically, based on the 1969 Protocol, a well-founded fear of persecution is based on a protected ground. And there are 5 protected grounds: race, religion, nationality, social group, or political opinion. That is what we get from the 51 Convention and the 69 Protocol. A refugee has to have a well-founded fear, and has to fit within one of these 5 protected characteristics, protected grounds. It can't just be anybody crossing an international border who's afraid to go back to their home country because of war, because of the gangs, because of organized crime, or any kind of violence. It has to be based on one of these protected grounds. They also have to be outside of their own country. They can't be within their own country. So they have to cross an international border and be afraid to return. So that's kind of a very broad, extremely broad overview of what a refugee is and the definition of a refugee under the convention. And many countries are signatories to the convention. Some are signatories to the convention and the protocol. Some are just signatories to the convention. The United States is a signatory to both. There are other conventions within Africa and the Americas that actually grant, there's the Cartagena Declaration, and then there's the Organization of African, I think it's African Unity Convention, so Africa and the Americas, that have a broader definition of the word refugee. And so those recognize anyone fleeing war, occupation, rights abuses, etc. And so they don't necessarily have to show that they're a refugee or they fear returning to their home country because of race, religion, nationality, social group, or political opinion. They could just be fleeing war. And so, for example, in Africa, when there were the huge civil wars in West Africa and Sierra Leone and Liberia, those fleeing Sierra Leone into another African nation that's a signatory to the OAU Convention could get refugee status just based on the fact that they're fleeing internal conflict. And most African nations are signatories to the OAU Convention. So people are able to get refugee status in a safe third country or in a host country once they flee. Otherwise, they have to meet the refugee definition. In the United States is not a signatory to the OAU Convention or the Cartagena Declaration. We are only signatories to the Convention and the Protocol. So asylum seekers come to the United States and file asylum applications either before an immigration judge or before an asylum officer, and they seek protection in the United States because they have a fear of returning, and it has to be based on one of these 5 protected grounds. It has to be a race, religion, nationality, social group, or political opinion. And so in the United States, we have a lot of different asylum cases. We have a lot of different types of asylum cases. We have people fleeing Afghanistan based on their political opinion. We have people fleeing other parts of the world, Iran, because they are a religious minority. Those are the 2 examples that are coming to me off the top of my mind, because we represent a lot of people in my current job from Afghanistan, from Iran, a lot of political cases from Nicaragua, from Venezuela, depending on, the situation, the political situation in the home country. Does anybody have any questions? I feel like I've been doing a lot of talking. Okay, I'm going to move on to Okay, what is an internally displaced person? In fact, there are more internally displaced persons than there are refugees. Most people don't flee an international border. Sometimes I feel like refugees and asylum seekers have a higher number, but the reality is internal displacement is a much larger a situation that the world has to contend with, specifically UNHCR, um, because people don't always flee an international border. They flee their homes and they go to another part of their home country. So they're still inside they're still inside their own country. They're driven by conflict, violence, or disaster. So it could be a natural disaster. It could be violence. For example, in Ukraine, there are a lot of internally displaced persons fleeing different parts of Ukraine, depending on which areas are either under Russian control or areas that Russia has been attacking. There's also a huge internally displaced situation in Sudan, given all of the fighting in Darfur. There's also internal displacement within Afghanistan, even though a lot of the refugees crossed international borders. Many who have come back are not able to go back to where they were living before, and they're internally displaced within the country. The national government is responsible for their protection. So we don't think about international protection. For instance, we don't have, there are conventions, there are guiding principles on internal displacement depending on whether or not a nation is a signatory to these guiding principles. They don't necessarily have to look out for those who are internally displaced the way that they would have an obligation under the 51 Convention and the 69 Protocol. But there has been so much more advocacy in the past few decades for internally displaced persons, in that the government has to protect them. The problem becomes when there is a civil war and there's the national government on one side and opposition forces on the other side. How can the national government necessarily look after those who are fleeing based on potentially their affiliation with one side or the other? Someone has a question? I see a hand up. Joanne.
Yeah, I was just curious about Gaza and Lebanon and how folks there are getting classified. It sounds like it would be internally displaced.
Right. So the situation in Palestine is very different. There's an entire section of the UN that works on protecting the Palestinians. As far as Lebanon, you're absolutely right. There's most likely a huge IDP problem. And that's because there's international bombardment, I suppose, from Israel into Lebanon, and many are not necessarily crossing an international border. And so the government, obviously, of Lebanon is responsible for it's called care and maintenance of the internally displaced. So that's absolutely correct. I don't know if there are large refugee numbers from Lebanon. Most likely there is some who have crossed an international border, but I'm not 100% sure what that number is. But I agree with you. It's probably more on the side of IDP, international displacement. Jill, did you have your hand up? No. Okay.
Yeah, continue on. My
okay.
mistake.
Oh, yeah, sure. Okay, so where are refugees coming from? I just thought I'd put this slide on here so it kind of gives everybody a visual kind of world picture of what we're seeing. I used to be an asylum officer, so I used to look at these numbers. We used to be told to look at these numbers quite a bit because sometimes those countries that are listed where most refugees are coming from could necessarily correspond with, the types of cases we would be seeing at the asylum office here in the United States, but not always. Most of the refugees, persons who are leaving their home country, are actually from Sudan. And in my opinion, Sudan is a very forgotten conflict, given all of the disaster that's going on in the world today. There's a lot going on in Sudan. When I worked in Egypt, I did refugee status determination, mainly for the Sudanese, but that was almost 10 years ago. And during that time, the conflict had actually died down quite a bit. It wasn't unsafe to go back to Sudan, but many people did not want to go back to Sudan. And then the heart of the conflict was in 2003 in Darfur, and it's been so terrible in the last few years in Sudan. Potentially bordering genocide, but that's, again, there are differing opinions whether or not there's a genocide in Darfur now, but there is a lot of conflict in Sudan, and so there are many refugees. My assumption is a lot of those refugees from Sudan go to neighboring Chad, or they used to go to neighboring Libya. Some of them go to Egypt, but they go to the neighboring states within Africa. And then there's Syria. We still have a large number from Syria, although the conflict ended a few years ago. Afghanistan has always been a very large group of refugees, although it's getting harder and harder for those from Afghanistan to find protection in neighboring countries, because there have been stricter enforcement of immigration laws in Pakistan, where most Afghans do seek asylum or do flee to. Many of them have been told to leave Pakistan and go back to Afghanistan. Ukraine, as we know, and they're traveling all over the world seeking safety. Democratic Republic of Congo and Venezuela. We see a lot of Venezuelan asylum cases in the Bay Area. I live in the Bay Area. And Democratic Republic of Congo, in the eastern part of Congo, there has been a lot of conflict. So these are the top countries. 85% of all refugees originate just from 10 countries, and we only have 6 of those up here, where most of them probably originate from. Let's see here. And which countries have the most IDPs? And here we go. Again, Sudan. The Sudanese have nowhere to go a lot of times. A lot of times the countries that
displaced.
Internally displaced. Sorry. And which countries have the most internally displaced? People who have not necessarily crossed an international border, but are living within the country that they need to flee from, but they have nowhere to go, so they go to another part of their country. Again, it's Sudan. Many Sudanese have crossed international borders, and only to come back to Sudan. So they've gone into Chad. Things are not great in Chad. Things are not great in Niger. So they go back, which is another neighboring country. They go back to Sudan. They don't go back to Darfur, which is, where is it? I think it's the western part of Sudan. There are several states where there's a lot of conflict. They go to the capital, which is Khartoum, or they go to other parts of the country. Syria has always had an internal displacement issue. Even though the conflict is over, people have not gone back to their homes. They continue to be displaced. And another large country that a large population of displacement are the Colombians. We see a lot of Colombian asylum seekers in my current job where I work. There are a lot of Colombian asylum seekers in the United States. Many who cannot travel to the United States, many who cannot travel to another safe country to seek asylum. Many go to Venezuela, many go to different parts of Latin America, but many just have to move within Colombia. There's a lot of internal displacement based on violence. There's a lot of cartel violence, not necessarily cartels, but organized groups such as the FARC, and I don't know what the FARC stands for, Jill, maybe you know, or some of the other organized criminal groups or paramilitary groups. People can't live in their home. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. The FARC is a rebel group.
They're a rebel group.
Yeah, but what most people don't know is the FARC followed international humanitarian law and the international committee. Always followed this. And somebody from the Colombian government decided to steal a jacket that said IFRC. Go and hold a talk in the jungle. And so we're going to move the people to a safer place. And of course, FARC said okay. And what it was, the government had lied, using a Red Cross symbol, which was the jacket, which was neutral and impartial. And it's the first time that Colombia publicly apologized to the ICRC, International Committee of Red Cross, that upholds international humanitarian law, for lying. And most people don't know that about the FARC. The FARC doesn't exist as much. There's now a new rebel group that's taken over from the FARC. But what's interesting is the FARC was following international humanitarian law. The Colombian government wasn't.
Jill, we can't hear you because whoever's got all that background noise, it's going on the whole time you were talking.
Oh,
We
could you
can
please
barely hear you.
turn off all your mics, Molly? Thank you. The FARC is a rebel group in Colombia that followed the International Committee of Red Cross and IHL to the letter. And they were holding hostages in the jungle in Colombia. And the Colombian government came and had stolen a jacket that was the International Committee of Red Cross jacket, because we're neutral and impartial, and gone to the FARC and said, we're going to move your hostages to a safer place. And because the FARC trusted the International Committee of Red Cross, they released the hostages to them. But it wasn't that they were releasing them to the ICRC, they were releasing them to the Colombian government. So it put many, many workers that work in international humanitarian law in Red Cross at risk, because the FARC was no longer going to trust Red Cross workers. So the Colombian government publicly apologized in front of the world that they had made a mistake. And I think that's a story that's worth knowing about. It's like international humanitarian law is to protect the most vulnerable. Prisoners of war is to protect the people who are wounded, and basically this was an area where Colombia did something against the law, international humanitarian law. That's it.
All right. Any other questions on internal displacement? All right. So I wanted to talk a little bit. Hold on one second. I feel like I'm missing a slide. Okay. I wanted to talk a little bit.
Stateless.
Yeah, I didn't have a slide for stateless people, but I wanted to talk about.
I can tell you about the stateless if you want, because I work with the stateless.
Okay, why don't you go ahead and do that?
Okay. There's a wonderful organization called UnitedStateless.org, and I put it in the chat for you. A woman named Karina, who was stateless herself, initiated some laws within the American government to enable people who are stateless to become citizens, a track for citizenship. But stateless are people who've had to flee their own country without their papers, and perhaps they were refugees and were signed in by the UNHCR or signed in by the ICRC registering to a camp, and they had papers, but there was no way they could flee with the papers. And so they arrive in a foreign country, and they don't have any access to any services because they're not seen as coming from another country. Or what happens is a country disappears, it ceases to exist, and so therefore they can't be from that country. And it's very dangerous. There's even a movie that I'll put in this chat as well about the stateless and the plight of people who have no citizenship, who can't get health services, who can't get transportation, who can't get any kind of schooling because they don't have a citizenship. And so that's one of the things that I think is really important. Stateless people are people who don't have any citizenship from their country of origin. And if they do, they have no record or way of proving it.
Right. And there are different ways a person can become stateless. I mean, some people are born stateless because their parents are from a different country. And if their parents are from a different country than where the child is born, there's a potential that the country where the parent is from won't allow that child to be a citizen of the country of the mother because they don't grant citizenship to people who are born abroad. And if the child is born in a country where birthright citizenship does not exist, then the child could become stateless. And so a lot of the advocacy around statelessness is to look at how people who are stateless are treated in the country that they're living in. And in many cases, if you don't have any citizenship, you don't have a passport. Many people cannot travel within that country. They can't leave that country. They're not eligible for benefits, Social Security, Medicaid, medical benefits, etc. They may not be able to enroll their children these stateless children in school. So there are a lot of there are a lot of things that would cause discrimination against people who are stateless if they if the government where they're living doesn't recognize them. There has been some movement across the world. I know that there were a lot of potentially stateless people in Tanzania, refugees who were coming from Burundi, and their children were not recognized as Burundians. The refugees' children were not recognized as Burundians. And there's no, I believe at the time, no birthright citizenship in Tanzania, and Tanzania granted all of them citizenship, so that they would have access to different things within that country, within Tanzania. Otherwise, in many cases, specific groups will be left without a nationality. And it tends to be people of certain ethnicities, certain racial groups, religious minorities. And so statelessness can happen. And so there is some talk, right now, birthright citizenship is at the Supreme Court in the United States. If for some reason, let's knock on wood, the Supreme Court does not allow birthright citizenship to continue, even though it's in the Constitution, there could be a lot of babies who are born post-decision who could end up stateless, depending on whether or not they're able to access citizenship of where their parents are from. So I believe that is one of the arguments that are being made. Does anyone have any questions? Jill, do you want to say something?
No, that's fine. I'm fine.
Okay. Got it. Let's see, where did I leave off? Okay, durable solutions. So we talk about 3 different durable solutions for refugees. And remember, there are so many people who are refugees around the world. There are 3 main durable solutions. And I mean, these are the obvious durable solutions for the refugees. They go back, they locally integrate in the country where they're seeking refuge, or they're resettled to a third country. So they can go back, they can stay, or they can go to a third country. There are really no other options for refugees. And there's so many refugees around the world living in refugee camps still today, or living as urban refugees in different cities around the world. So it's dependent upon whether or not they can return for voluntary repatriation. And the key word there is voluntary. It's not forced repatriation. It's voluntary repatriation. UNHCR does help certain refugees in certain countries voluntarily repatriate to their home country if they so choose. And the point here is that it's, like I said, voluntary. The refugees should be allowed the opportunity to go back to their home country in a dignified manner. So UNHCR will have these voluntary repatriation kind of packets. And there's a stipend, there's supplies, and then there's basically a ride home. And then there's reception by UNHCR or the host or the home government when the refugee returns home. So voluntary repatriation is one of the durable solutions. Yes, Jill.
During the Bosnian War, what Tuđman, who was the president of Croatia, did was told all the refugees that they would have to go back to Mostar, which was still at war. Mostar was a city that was still at war, and was about 2 hours from where the refugees were in a safe place in Croatia. That we were able to stop guards and bus drivers by explaining to them that under international humanitarian law, civilians are protected, and that any guard or bus driver who suddenly put them onto the bus could be tried for war crimes. So we were able to say that those people are refugees if that took place. So things like that happen on frequent basis.
Right. And protracted refugee situations, and a protracted refugee situation is where a refugee group has been living in another country for a very long time. And you're thinking of decades where generations of refugees are now living. In those situations, you know, and if the place that they're fleeing from has become peaceful, or they will accept these refugees and not, you know, make them refugees again, and there's no well-founded fear for them to return. Those tend to be the types of people that go back to their home country. I mean, there was a large voluntary repatriation exercise many years ago. I remember UNHCR was putting that together in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where not in the east, but I believe in the west, there were thousands of Angolans living there. And there used to be a civil war in Angola a long time ago. And they were not granted refugee protection really in the DRC. They were not resettled to a third country, and so voluntary repatriation. It's also a very political move as well, as Jill was highlighting in Bosnia. And the Angolans were, you know, as a group, voluntarily repatriated to their home country out of Democratic Republic of Congo. The second one is local integration, rebuilding a life and gaining rights in the host country. And so that's very common. You know, refugees in the United States locally integrate. We have a local integration network and process for those who seek asylum in the United States. They cross over the international border, they seek asylum, they get asylum, and they're able to locally integrate into the United States. That's typical for asylum seekers, and that happens in Europe as well. Large groups of people coming, you know, into a third country. For example, there were a lot of, I had mentioned Burundians coming into Tanzania. I worked in Tanzania for a little bit. There were a lot of Burundians and Rwandans in Tanzania, and many had gone to Kenya as well. And I remember there was a movement, I don't remember what happened, but there was a movement to locally integrate and give citizenship, not just to the stateless children of the refugees, but also giving citizenship to the parents, because there were very similar languages, cultures, and customs between some Burundian refugees and the Tanzanian community where they were living. And so they were able to locally integrate at that time. But, you know, and as mentioned here on the slide, there were stateless people who also gained citizenship as a method of local integration. Resettlement, and that's an area that I've been working in recently. I work for a refugee resettlement agency. Only 1% of all refugees generally ever get resettled to a safe country, a third country. The third country would have to agree to take them and provide care and maintenance upon their arrival and offer them permanency and stability. There's a huge need, obviously, for resettlement. It's a very coveted durable solution for many refugees, millions of refugees around the world. But only 1% of all refugees are able to actually be resettled worldwide. And as you know, this new administration has halted the refugee resettlement program for every country in the world, except for, I believe it's South Africa. Before that, our resettlement numbers within the United States have always been pretty steady, from 75,000 to 100,000 resettled refugees from mainly Africa and Afghanistan and parts of Asia, also Latin America, were able to come to the United States in a dignified, controlled, vetted manner. And once they come into the United States through the resettlement process, they are refugees. And within a year after their arrival, they're able to seek permanent residency, get a green card, apply for a green card. And so they have a pathway to permanency and stability through the resettlement process. However, that's been halted for the last 2 years, and that's been very challenging for organizations who seek to serve the refugees and continue to serve the refugees upon their arrival for, you know, anywhere from 90 days to 3 to 5 years, depending on the family's needs. And there are a lot of needs for a lot of refugees when they first arrive to the United States. Yeah, Jill.
I was going to say, Margot Hillman has a question for you. For those
Oh,
seeking
yeah.
refugee status in the U.S., she says, am I correct that fleeing domestic violence or having been trafficked would not be grounds to get refugee status in the U.S.?
Good question. So under our asylum laws, I would think yes. So if someone comes to the border of the United States, or they fly into the United States and they didn't go through the resettlement process, but they're seeking asylum in the US, we definitely did have some pretty helpful law in either the administrative appeals precedent or the federal precedent that allows for victims of domestic violence, depending on their situation and the country they come from and how well the argument is crafted, to be granted asylum based on that type of persecution. Similar with trafficking victims. The key component in both of those could be gender. So we call it gender-based violence asylum. And that's taken a very large hit in this current administration with the administration's or with different administrative appeals decisions, making it a lot harder for women seeking asylum based on gender-based violence. But it's definitely there was a time where, yes, that without question could be a basis. Good question. Thanks for asking. Any other questions?
What about, somebody said, what about the seeking refugee status in the U.S.? Okay. What about the forced solution that ICE is enacting, involuntary repatriation? Where do those people get counted?
Okay. I didn't hear you completely, Jill. It could be my speakers.
It's in the chat.
Okay, wait,
about
I
ICE.
can't. Okay, let me see if I can
What
see the
about
chat.
the forced solution that ICE is enacting, involuntary repatriation? Where do those people get counted?
Let's see.
Were you able to get that?
Okay, yeah, here it is. I see it. What about the forced solution that ICE is involuntary? I mean, that's a good question. That's definitely not voluntary repatriation. I don't even know if it's legal. It doesn't come within the UNHCR mandate of one of the 3 durable solutions. Now, the people who are being forced and threatened to leave the United States, they may not actually have refugee status yet. They might be in the process of seeking asylum to become a refugee, or they may have lost their refugee claim. Either way, it's not a dignified repatriation if it's not voluntary. I don't think the U.S. is counting, those numbers in any, reporting them to UNHCR or anything like that. So I don't know where they get counted, but I know that what's happening is not voluntary repatriation. There's nothing dignified about the way it's happening. Okay. So let's. I'm supposed to do this for 30 minutes and then open it up for questions. So we've had a lot of really great questions. I can also look through the chat now that I'm not doing the slides. If someone is a refugee and they return or visit their home country, do they lose their status? Okay, wait. So I'm going to go through the chat and answer some of these questions. Okay, so T visas for people who are trafficked. Exactly. In the United States, for persons who have been trafficked based on labor trafficking or sex trafficking, if they meet a certain definition, they definitely could get what's called a T visa, a trafficking visa within the United States. Monica, did you, when you were practicing, did you help people get T visas? Okay, she's frozen. Okay.
Trying to unmute. Oh, wait, am I
oh.
unmuted now?
You're unmuted.
Yeah, okay. No, I did U visas.
Okay. All right. You did U visas. Okay.
But
And let's also
I
explain
did
to
asylum way back, you know.
right. Oh, then you probably have a lot of stories to tell about asylum way back.
No, you have a lot more than I do.
um, so yeah, we have two other forms of relief. They're humanitarian forms of relief in the United States. They're called U visas and T visas. So victims of trafficking, victims of certain crimes in the United States can apply for these two types of their statuses. They're not necessarily visas because they're applying within the United States to stay in the US and seek protection. So if someone was a victim of a certain crime, we've seen all kinds of crime, felonies, assault, battery, domestic violence.
Domestic violence, that's the
Attempted murder, robbery, you name it, sexual violence. As long as they're cooperating with the police in the United States to solve the crime, they could apply for a U visa. And then the T visas are just specific to trafficking, and there's a very, very specific definition of trafficking. It could be labor trafficking, it could be sex trafficking. It has to be done by what's called fraud, force, or coercion. The person didn't know that this was going to happen to them. They were forced to do certain things. It's a large definition. It's a whole area of immigration law, but it's a very helpful tool to help victims of trafficking who live in the United States and don't have immigration status. And we have to clarify the difference. Yes, there is a difference in the United States between a refugee and an asylee. So a person who gets asylum status or someone who applies for asylum within the United States. They come to the US from an international border, they cross over from Mexico, or they fly into an airport, they had a tourist visa and they decide they don't want to go back to their home country. They can apply for asylum status in the United States. Refugees kind of come from that resettlement pipeline that I had mentioned. Once they enter the U.S. through the resettlement, number 3 here, they're processed overseas. They're processed in a refugee camp, or they're processed in, an urban city like Cairo, or I don't know. In Kenya, some of them are processed in Nairobi. In South Africa, many of them are processed in Cape Town or in Johannesburg or in Pretoria, where the UNHCR office is. And they're processed there. The U.S. government goes there, interviews them, sees that they meet the refugee definition. They're not a security threat or anything like that. And then they put them on a plane and they enter the United States. On the day they enter, they're a refugee. So they don't have to apply to become a refugee anymore. They enter the U.S. with status. And so there's the refugee and then there's the asylee, 2 different statuses. Let's see, are there any other questions? Thanks for that, Monica.
There's another question. Is an outbreak of infectious disease like Ebola qualify someone for this kind of status? Does an outbreak of an infectious disease like Ebola qualify someone for some kind of status?
Monica, what do you think? It can be really hard to pass any health screenings before coming into the United States to get a visa to come, but there isn't a specific type of status. The only thing I can think of, we have something called humanitarian parole, where it's very hard to get, and if someone needs life or death medical treatment in the U.S., they could apply for that. It's nearly impossible, and because of the infectiousness of Ebola, I don't know that would be approved. And then there was another comment. There was a recent case in Pennsylvania where a man cooperating with the police to solve a crime was detained by ICE. Yeah. I mean, just having a pending U visa application doesn't give you immigration legal status in the US. It's still pending. And the U visa applications take many years for approval now. So that's unfortunate. That's a good type of scenario to think about, Sandy. Thank you. Female genital mutilation, we call it FGM or FGC, definitely is a very strong basis to get asylum. I don't believe that that's really been changed in this current administration, and they definitely the law hasn't changed in that regard as much as domestic violence. But that's I hope that this female client of yours sought asylum.
I'll tell you what happened. If you want, I'll tell you what happened with her.
Please.
Because I was working in a domestic violence shelter and she showed up there. And that's how we learned her story. Unfortunately, she was underage and she was forced to go back to Egypt. She came back after her college break and it had been done. And she came back to finish her education, and she came to talk to me because we lined her up with some counseling to deal with what had been done to her. And upon her, because I'm old, I've been around a while, okay? Upon her becoming an adult, she did go to get her U.S. citizenship, but we weren't able to stop it before it happened.
It's unfortunate. Thank you for sharing. Okay. These were all really good questions. I feel like you guys are experts. Averaged. Okay. Are there any other? I'm going through the chat to see if we can. If I missed a question. Okay. Here we go. I keep muting myself. If someone is a refugee and they return to visit their home country, do they lose their status? That's a good question. It depends on the circumstances, right? It depends on the circumstances. Do they go back to their home country to live, or like you said, to visit? How long was the visit? Did they go back to the place that they were persecuted? Were they in hiding? Did they go back, for 2 or 3 days? And if there was a funeral or somebody was really sick or there was a family emergency or something like that, they had to go back. They needed to go back, but they only did what was necessary and came right back to the United States. There's an argument that can be made that they did not lose their refugee status, but I would be really careful if that person is returning after a home. First, as an attorney, I counsel everybody not to go to the home country once they've been given refugee status or they've won their asylum case in the United States, especially if they have a pending asylum application. I strongly recommend that they don't go back to their home country. But if they absolutely have to, it needs to be a very short visit and they need to not go back to the place where they fear being persecuted. And even with all of those kind of guardrails, it could be still very hard for them to re-enter the United States because they could come back with, I don't know, when they come back into the United States, if they go through the border, if they go through the airport, Customs and Border Protection could very well ask where they went. They can find out that they're an asylee or a refugee, and they could ask them if they went back to their home country, and then they could have problems re-entering the United States. Good question. Sorry, I missed that one. Are there any other questions? Okay, I think I got all the questions, Jill. Do we want to ask if anyone else has any questions or?
Sure. Does anybody else have any questions? Rena, I thank you so much for presenting this today. It's something that's so current and happening, so very
Definitely.
important. Yeah.
Yes.
And we'll send you a follow-up email with any resources, added resources that Rena has, and also we'll send you the recording for those of you so that you can listen to it at your own leisure. But I also wanted to let you know we're teaching on the 25th, we're teaching at 5 o'clock Pacific time, International Humanitarian Law is a basic course. And Kathy Sue from Hawaii and I will be teaching it. It's 90 minutes long. If you want to know about the international humanitarian laws that protect the most vulnerable in the whole world.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Monica, for coming and offering your expertise too. Hope to meet you in person. Hope to meet all of you in person someday.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful, wonderful week. Take really
Bye,
good care.
everyone.
And thank you so much
Bye
for
now.
doing this.